We're back to Authors Corner on the Total Education Network. Again, TotalTutor.net for more information. Twitter, Total Tutor, Neil S. Haley. Facebook, LinkedIn, Neil Haley. And Authors Corner continues to have the most interesting guests. And I would consider this person a celebrity. I was talking to her offline, and I think she chuckled a bit or said I had to keep my secret my whole life. So I want to welcome to the program author, the untold story from inside his family, Uncle Al Capone, Deirdre Marie Capone. Deirdre, thanks for calling.
Well, you're very welcome. I'm looking forward to this.
Oh, I'm just excited as can be to talk to you because I mean, this is water cooler right there. Did you know I interviewed someone from the Capone family? People first of all would have said, "Really? Are you serious?" So I think the first kind of question is specifically enough. You couldn't tell people for a long time that you were a member of the Capone family. Am I correct?
Correct. It was very difficult for me to grow up in Chicago with the last name Capone. My father was the firstborn of his generation, so his father never changed his name because my father was going to play the role in the Capone family that John Fitzgerald Kennedy played in the Kennedy family. He was going to bring respectability back to the Capone name and also straighten out some of the misinformation, some of the facts that people think are true that are not. My father couldn't bear up under, carrying that burden, and he did take his own life just before my 11th birthday. So I'm doing the job that he was doing. As a matter of fact, he was writing a book at the time of his death, and I did read it. So a lot of the facts that I have came from there and came from my grandfather.
So when you talked about kind of keeping it a secret, your father did not want you to tell people that you were related to Al?
When he entered me in school, he entered me using his middle name as though it were my last name. My father was Ralph Gabriel Capone. In the Italian tradition, he was named after his father and his grandfather. His grandfather was Gabriel. And so when he entered me in school, he entered me as Deirdre Gabriel. I went to a Catholic school, and the nuns and the priests knew who I was, so every time they administered sacrament to me, they would go Deirdre Gabriel Capone under their breath, just so that it would be totally legal. But Al Capone died on my 7th birthday, and my family needed something joyous to look forward to. And Catholic children make their first communion when they're in 2nd grade, and it was always in the past on Mother's Day. And, of course, that Mother's Day would be the first Mother's Day that my grandmother, Al's mother, didn't have her beloved, Al with her. So we got together as a family. The whole family came to church to watch me make my first communion, and then we all went back to the Capone house for a big family picnic. But back in those days, there were local editions of the Chicago papers that would usually come out on Monday. So the two papers, the Chicago Tribune and the American, came out on Monday saying the children at St. Philip Neri School made their first communion, and Deirdre Capone, with the entire Capone family in attendance, made hers. Well, how many Deirdres do you think were in the city of Chicago, let alone this little tiny school on the south side?
Exactly.
So, and when Al died, of course, all of the newspapers, carried all the alleged things that he did or anybody in my family did again. So my classmates' parents were being educated, wrongly so, for the first time in their lives to what was going on in the 20s and 30s. And so after that, two weeks after, Mother's Day, every boy and every girl in my 2nd grade class was invited to this girl's birthday party, but not me. So that's when it started. Nobody was allowed to have anything to do with me. I would have a birthday party. Nobody would come. I was never invited to anybody's party, and I stayed at that same campus all the way through 12th grade, and it never changed. So I learned to be very shy. I learned to not, tell anybody who I was. And in 1972, my husband and I had a chance to leave Chicago to go to Minnesota to he was starting his own business. So I got up there, nobody knew who I was, and my wings literally spread. I did things. I credit the strong Capone genes for some of the amazing things that I did. But, I learned to hide.
Well, definitely learning to hide. But see, I want to touch upon something, but I don't want to give away the book. And that's why if I had a long interview with you, I would give certain parts away. So short interviews are the perfect thing because I want people to pick up this book. I want people to read this book. So that's always what I look at. And I always look at my listeners and what kind of questions they would ask. First, the kind of question is, you're surprising me when you say the truth about Al Capone, because we all know that basically, I guess anybody who really doesn't do a lot of research or read your book is that he was the notorious gangster in Chicago, and that he killed many people and was involved in, and he's one of the big organized crime guys. For you to say specifically a lot of those were untruths is news in itself, right?
Well, I will tell you and your audience, no Capone had anything to do with the Valentine's Day massacre. And also, Al Capone testified for 11 days after the Valentine's Day massacre before the federal court in Chicago. And there was nothing that he was convicted of except income tax evasion. That was it. Now, was there bloodshed? Of course. But there was more bloodshed in the newspaper wars during those days and in the police business than ever were in the beer business. And the beer wars were brought about because of politicians.
Right.
The politicians would decide whose beer was going to be served in this speakeasy, and then they would get a kickback for it. And also what most people don't really realize is that nobody wanted Prohibition. And Chicago was the wettest city in the United States of America because the then mayor of Chicago, Bill Thompson, didn't believe in the 18th Amendment. In fact, he told his police force to not enforce it. There was never a raid on a speakeasy during those days in Chicago that had any people in it. They always knew the raid was going to come, so there was no customers, just the bartender there. And all he said was he was serving root beer. But at least the press got satisfaction that they were trying to do something. But because it was the wettest city, because there were more speakeasies, that's why Al Capone is known as he is known, because he had the biggest business in the country.
And always the most success in business and entrepreneurship, the more people attack you from different directions, especially with, again, everyone was not following the rules of Prohibition. Forget about it.
Correct.
We're going to do whatever we want to do. And there's stories about this all over the place of people that were involved in the beer business and in the alcoholic business. And then when it became legal again, there was no attacks or anything about it. It was just based on that time of Prohibition. Now, thinking about specifically the question, organized crime. I did interview someone that was in organized crime. They couldn't say which family it was. And you're immediate afterwards of Capone. But do you believe he was an organized crime boss, or that again is another falsehood, that it was not? He's not a mafioso, and that this is again a lot of fabricated stories?
Well, if you remember, if you watch Boardwalk Empire, and they talk about Nookie Thompson, but he was Nookie Johnson, really, in real life, there was a big meeting of all of the major bootleggers in Atlantic City in 1929. And they all got together, and they decided to organize. That's where organized crime really came from.
Okay.
But one of the deals that they made was they wanted to stop the violence. And they all agreed to stopping the violence. It was right the next day that Al Capone got arrested on the streets of Philadelphia for carrying a concealed weapon. And he was put into prison there for a year. They did that on purpose, the other bootleggers, because they didn't want to stop the violence. And they knew if Al Capone could stop it in Chicago, they would all have to follow suit. So there's so many facts and factoids of, that time in our history that people don't know, and I just want to tell them.
Well, we're talking Deirdre Marie Capone, author of Uncle Al Capone, the untold story from inside his family. And I'm shocked right from the beginning. And when I try to do when I interview people is get the talking points. And this one I said, this will be simple. And I'm shocked. I really did not expect to paint the picture of Al Capone like you're painting. And when you talk about organized crime, mafioso, different situations. There's a lot of other crime groups, but Capone got this big name. So what would surprise our listeners about the humanitarian that he was, or I guess the straight and narrow Al Capone that people would probably drop off their chairs right now listening to this interview?
Al Capone and my grandfather, Ralph Capone, who were business partners, and my grandfather really ran the things. They were the first people in the world to open up soup kitchens after the stock market crash.
Oh, my gosh.
They fed people on the streets of Chicago for almost 2 years. As a matter of fact, in 1930, my Uncle Al was on the cover of Time magazine as Man of the Year.
I didn't know that. So, again, things forgotten. People want to paint a picture in different ways on this. And were you surprised as well? I mean, you grew up in the family, but then you had to take a lot of your father's notes in developing and writing this book. Were there surprises about your uncle that you had no idea about?
Well, the one thing I want you and your listeners to know is that Al Capone and Ralph Capone were brought down in 1930 by a small group of businessmen, and the only thing they could get either person on was income tax evasion. When the income tax law was first drafted in 1917, there was a provision in the law that said people did not have to pay tax on any money that they earned illegally, because that would be against their Fifth Amendment rights. I mean, if they put it down, then all the IRS agent would have to do is call the police and say, he was gambling, arrest him.
Right, exactly.
So none of these bootleggers knew that they had to do that. When they found out, they tried to pay their taxes. But a group of businessmen in Chicago knew that the end of Prohibition was coming. It ended in 1933, so now this is at the end of 1930. They knew that the most successful bootlegging operation in the United States was the Capone outfit. And if the Capone outfit was still in business when Prohibition ended, they would have been the biggest liquor distributors in the world. And they were Italian, and these businessmen didn't want them to be successful. So they arrested my grandfather. Same amount of money, same years. He got 3 years in the federal penitentiary. They convicted Al Capone on false evidence, and they sentenced him to 11 years. Al Capone tried to pay the federal government $2 million just to call it quits. They didn't take it.
So what about, in your opinion, about mafia? And what was Al's opinion on that? I mean, because there are lots of organized crime that are doing a lot more things than just bootlegging. When the whole push of mafiosos, Italian mafia, now I guess the Russian mafia, did Al ever consider himself part of that group, or did he just hate it, and he hated hearing himself compared to that?
Number one, in order to be part of the mafia, you must be Sicilian, and my family is not Sicilian, so they couldn't be part of it. There was no real mafia back then. There was the Union Salone, and that was all mafia, and it has evolved into what is now known as mafia. So there's two entirely different things here. And also, really, the only business that my family was in was mainly the beer business, some alcohol, gambling, and some very limited prostitution. That's it. My grandfather, after the meeting in Atlantic City, saw that there was going to be drugs coming into these organizations, and my family wanted nothing to do with drugs.
Oh, okay. So you're definitely being that spokesperson to say that all these stories are false. You got to pick up the book to learn absolutely more about it. What has been the response since the book has come out, Deirdre? Again, I understand you're a best-selling author. How have people taken to this, especially when there are people that are just don't like your uncle at all, Uncle Al. So, what is
one amazing thing that the book has done very well, but what I'm amazed at, Neil, is that there are authors that wrote about my family starting in the 60s. Big, successful books. They all made their reputation on proving that Al Capone did this, proving Al Capone did that, proving Al Capone did this. And one of the things I did document in my book is, and I've got the evidence, no Capone had anything to do with the Valentine's Day massacre. My book has been out 2 years now. None of these other authors have challenged me on that. I find that amazing because I know when they did their research, they were not convinced that Capone did it.
Okay, well, fantastic. I want all of our listeners to pick up this book. I'm looking at the cover, and it's such a surprise to me, and I'm so glad to hear all the success that you're having, and I'm sure people will probably want part 2 or more into specifically families like the Capones in ways. Just thinking of maybe you're not finished writing books for sure. So where can we find information on you, purchase your book, and learn more about you?
They can go to my website, which is unclealcapone.com. I have a blog. I'm putting things on there like all these other authors said. My uncle had 3 scars, on his left cheek. He did not. He had 1 major scar, a little tiny second one. But I used to sit on his lap. I used to kiss his scar. I used to say, does the boo-boo hurt? I can still see what that looked like. So, there's things like that who else can document this?
Except
Who
you.
Else? Yeah, nobody. And I still hear the sound of his voice in my head. I still have all the notes that my grandfather told me. I was afraid to put a lot of things in my book because I was afraid of people, saying that I didn't have proof. I think my ancestors have done something where a manuscript has been put into my lap that was written by a person you cannot refute, and he is backing up and documenting all the things that my grandfather told me. So I'm working on my second book right now.
Oh, well, you'll definitely come back on. I hope to talk about that at Author's Corner. And do you have any social media for our listeners out there? Do you Facebook or Twitter, or are you just pretty much...
I do. I'm on LinkedIn, Deirdre Marie Capone. I'm on Facebook, Deirdre Marie Capone, and I'm on Twitter as Deirdre Marie Cap because we're limited. So, yes, I'm all over the place, and I tweet and do all that.
Fantastic. I'll be tweeting it out when it airs on different syndication, and I appreciate you coming by to talk about it, and look forward to having you back when your next book's out. So good talking to you.
Oh, thanks, Neil. I enjoyed this very much.
I enjoyed it a lot. You really you educated me for sure on Al Capone, so good talking to you.
All right, thanks.
All right, bye-bye. All right, you're listening to Author's Corner, and we'll be back in just a moment.